Centuries of laws, scorn, and closed doors tried to keep women out of labs, cockpits, courts, and parliaments. Yet some didn't just break through, they rewrote what was possible. Facing lack of education, violence, and outright bans, these pioneers found loopholes, built secret labs, taught themselves at kitchen tables, and risked everything for a single breakthrough. In this short video, you'll meet the scientist who isolated a new element by hand, the mathematician who mapped a moonshot with a pencil and a lantern, and the pilot who took off from a field while the world told her to stay grounded. You'll see the tactics they used: resourceful workarounds, relentless practice, strategic alliances, and the tiny, repeatable decisions that turned impossible odds into historic wins. If you're staring at a barrier now, career bias, fear of failure, limited resources, these stories give a practical roadmap. Watch all the way through. First, we'll pull out 3 concrete lessons you can use tomorrow to turn your own no into a new horizon. 1. Introduction to women breaking barriers. Many institutions still place invisible barriers between talented women and leadership roles. Stereotypes about capability and role expectations, institutional gatekeeping in hiring and funding, and unequal caregiving burdens all conspire to limit opportunity. The problem shows up in boardrooms, classrooms, laboratories, and newsrooms alike. It is structural, not merely personal. Left unaddressed, these obstacles waste human potential and perpetuate cycles of exclusion. Women and their allies responded by building practical solutions that bypassed closed doors and rewrote the rules. They formed networks to share resources and opportunities. They launched organizations that focus on mentorship, training, and advocacy. Some challenged discriminatory laws and workplace practices through litigation and policy campaigns, while others created parallel institutions, companies, research centers, and media platforms where talent could thrive on its own terms. These strategic moves did more than protest. They created measurable pathways for advancement. Concrete examples show how varied tactics work in practice. In science and engineering, pioneers persisted despite exclusion. Marie Curie pursued cutting-edge research and broke into scientific institutions that had been reluctant to accept women. Katherine Johnson's precision in orbital calculations helped expand opportunities for women in aerospace and technology. In law and policy, advocates like Ruth Bader Ginsburg used litigation to dismantle legal barriers, producing precedents that widened professional access. In sports and culture, Billie Jean King mobilized peers to demand equal prize money and fair representation, fundamentally changing the economics and visibility of women's athletics. Contemporary initiatives also scale impact. Programs such as Girls Who Code provide hands-on training and community. Lean-in circles create peer mentorship and accountability. And global advocacy bodies coordinate policy and funding to expand educational access for girls. Corporations have introduced returnship programs, flexible work policies, and targeted leadership development to retain and promote women. And social finance models have enabled women entrepreneurs to secure capital where traditional lenders often declined. Applying these lessons to everyday life is straightforward and effective. Sponsor and mentor deliberately. Identify one emerging woman in your field and advocate for her promotion or funding. Sponsorship often shifts careers more than advice alone. Push for institutional changes such as transparent hiring criteria, measurable diversity goals, and family-friendly policies. Small policy shifts remove hidden barriers quickly. Support organizations that train and fund women, donate, volunteer, or partner, and amplify women's achievements in media and professional networks so role models become visible. Use practical tools like blind screening in recruitment and structured interview rubrics to reduce bias in selection, and create feedback loops to monitor progress and adjust strategies. Choose one concrete action today and begin integrating it into your routine. Mentor someone, sign up to volunteer with a training program, advocate for a parental leave policy at work, or intentionally buy from a woman-led business. Change is cumulative. Consistent, specific interventions expand opportunity far beyond any single success. Take a step now and help turn barriers into bridges. 2. Amelia Earhart's aviation defiance. Aviation was written off as a man's world, with cockpit seats and headlines reserved for male daredevils, while female ambition was dismissed as decorative. Barriers weren't only social, they were financial, technical, and institutional. She faced derision from some in the press, skepticism from sponsors who doubted marketability, and an industry that offered few paths for women beyond novelty exhibitions. And yet she turned those roadblocks into the very fuel for her campaigns. She answered with audacity and meticulous preparation. First, she crossed the Atlantic as a member of a crew, proving a woman could perform under the same pressures as any pilot. Then she became the first woman to pilot a solo transatlantic flight, a feat that required not just courage, but mastery of navigation, weather reading, and aircraft handling under grueling conditions. She used publicity strategically, working with a publisher husband to frame her flights as demonstrations of competence, not curiosity, and that media savvy translated into sponsorships and a sustained platform for advocacy. Her methods were practical and repeatable. She helped found and then led a professional association for licensed female pilots that created networks, shared knowledge, and opened doors for training and jobs. She wrote books and delivered lectures that demystified flying for the public, and she took an instructional role at a university, advising students and promoting aeronautical education. On her final global attempt, she chose an advanced twin-engine aircraft and partnered with an experienced navigator, demonstrating an emphasis on planning and teamwork even while accepting risk. Those choices show how skill building, institutional support, and publicity combined into a coherent strategy for change. The legacy is not merely romantic. Her insistence on formal organizations, mentorship, and public engagement created durable pathways that persist today through flying clubs, scholarship programs, and industry outreach to women. Modern pilots and engineers still benefit from the networks she helped establish. The practical lesson for anyone facing systemic exclusion is clear. Pair exceptional performance with institution building, communicate broadly to win allies, and invest in technical training so barriers become defensible rather than permanent. Support the enduring work she started. Visit aviation museums that preserve original artifacts, read her own accounts to understand how she planned flights and rallied support, join or donate to organizations that fund women in aerospace, or simply enroll in an introductory flight course and experience the discipline she championed. Act now to turn admiration into action, for progress in the cockpit, in classrooms, and across the skies. 3. Marie Curie's scientific struggle. A makeshift shed in Paris and the constant hum of chemical apparatus were the backdrop to a struggle that combined scientific uncertainty, institutional bias, and sheer physical toil. Limited funding and inadequate facilities forced a focus on methods rather than majestic labs. Instruments were improvised, and routine measurements had to be invented or refined from scratch. On top of that, being a woman in a male-dominated scientific world meant persistent questioning of competence, restricted access to positions, and delayed recognition, even as results accumulated. She answered that squeeze of obstacles with relentless methodological rigor and practical ingenuity. Rather than accept poor sensitivity in existing detectors, she improved measurement techniques, adapting electrometric methods, and designing careful protocols to distinguish tiny signals from noise. Working with a close collaborator, she turned abstract observations into reproducible experiments, and when standard chemical routes failed to separate active substances, she returned to the fundamentals, repeated fractional crystallization, painstaking separation techniques, and patient record-keeping, until the active components could be isolated and characterized. Concrete examples show how these choices paid off. In cramped quarters, she processed large quantities of ore, carrying out cycles of dissolution, precipitation, and purification to concentrate faintly radioactive fractions. Each cycle required monitoring subtle changes in activity and chemical composition. She coined the term that captured a new physical property, and then used quantitative measurements to treat radioactivity as something that could be compared, measured, and manipulated. Collaboration mattered too. Pairing experimental craftsmanship with theoretical insight and peer critique made it possible to move from observation to explanation. Recognition eventually followed through major scientific honors and the establishment of a research institute that trained others and institutionalized techniques born of necessity. The implications of that struggle are still practical and immediate. Modern radiochemistry and medical applications depend on measurement standards, separation chemistry, and safety protocols that trace back to those early methods. Current regulations for handling radioactive materials and the very concept of radiological hygiene grew out of lessons learned from exposure risks and experimental carelessness. Equally important is the lesson about access and mentorship. Overcoming structural barriers required networks of support, publication, and institution building, and those same levers remain effective today for increasing diversity in STEM. Take a small, concrete step now. Support scholarships, volunteer at local science outreach programs, or simply read and share primary source accounts and museum exhibits that highlight these experimental stories. Encourage lab safety training in educational settings and back policies that fund hands-on research for underrepresented groups. Practical moves that honor the methods, courage, and legacy forged in that humble laboratory. 4. Harriet Tubman's escape network. When enslaved people risked escape, danger was everywhere. Patrols on roads, slave catchers with rewards, betrayals by intermediaries, and the law that punished both runaways and those who helped them. Ordinary routes could be fatal. That reality forced freedom seekers to rely on more than courage. They needed an organized, trusted system that could move people quietly and quickly through hostile territory. Harriet Tubman answered that need with a tightly woven network of routes, people, and methods that made escape possible for dozens and inspired many more. She did not work alone. Her operations connected free black communities, sympathetic white abolitionists, Quaker safe houses, and the documentation kept by activists in northern cities. Tubman personally led at least 13 missions back into slave states and guided roughly 70 individuals to freedom, and she collaborated with figures such as William Still in Philadelphia and Thomas Garrett in Wilmington, who provided crucial shelter, supplies, and records for those she helped. Tactics mattered as much as courage. Tubman relied on intimate knowledge of the land, marshes, rivers, and hidden paths, and used waterways to disguise movement when overland travel was too risky. Travel happened at night and in small groups. Signals and codes, often drawn from spirituals and everyday routines, helped maintain secrecy without leaving a paper trail. Money, clothing, and forged or borrowed papers were arranged when needed by abolitionist contacts. Tubman also brought a practical, stern leadership. She carried a pistol to prevent panic or desertion among those she led, and she refused to leave anyone behind whenever possible. Records kept by William Still include detailed accounts of many of the people Tubman guided, providing primary source proof of routes, rendezvous points, and the human stories behind each journey. The practical lessons from that escape network retain urgent relevance today for anyone organizing under risk. Build layered trust, decentralize decision-making, prepare contingencies, and cultivate allies across different communities. Mutual aid models, clandestine-style communications when safety requires, and meticulous documentation for future advocacy all have modern analogues in community defense, refugee assistance, and civil rights work. Learn from primary sources, published collections of abolitionist records, and Tubman's own contemporaneous accounts to understand these methods in depth. Support preservation efforts, volunteer with organizations that protect vulnerable people, and share authenticated histories so that the strategies and courage of those who engineered freedom are kept alive and actionable. 5. Ada Lovelace's computing vision. During the 19th century, mechanical calculators could only perform preset arithmetic routines, leaving no room for flexible instructions or creative applications. The problem was not a lack of gears, but a lack of conceptual separation between machine and program. Numeric engines were confined to calculation and nothing more. That narrowness stifled imagination and limited how such devices could be used beyond tables and sums. Her response was to reconceptualize what a computing machine could be: a general-purpose engine that manipulates symbols according to rules supplied by a human mind. In a translation of Luigi Menabrea's paper, she added extensive annotations, notes labeled A through G, that expanded the technical discussion into something far broader than mere calculation. Those notes are longer than the article they accompany, and contain what is widely regarded as the first published algorithm intended for implementation on a machine, the sequence for computing Bernoulli numbers. Short, but decisive. She made programming thinkable. The details matter. She worked closely with Charles Babbage's ideas about the analytical engine, but she moved beyond hardware descriptions to lay out how sequences of operations, tables of instructions, and punched cards could represent not just numbers, but any set of symbols. She argued explicitly that a machine could act on symbols and follow systematic rules, and she famously suggested that such an engine might one day compose complex pieces of music if given the right instructions. That single insight, treating information and rules as separable from the machine that executes them, anticipates modern software, compilers, and the idea of encoding procedures as reusable modules. Her Bernoulli algorithm in Note G shows concrete step-by-step logic, with operations and data flow clearly mapped out for a mechanical process to follow. Concise yet profound. Integration with today's practice is immediate and practical. Modern programming languages, the compiler pipeline, and the distinction between hardware and software all owe a conceptual debt to viewing instructions as first-class objects. That perspective makes it possible to write libraries, automate complex workflows, and create layers of abstraction in systems engineering. Algorithmic composition software and AI-driven music tools demonstrate the exact application she imagined: machines executing symbolic rules to produce art-like output. Study of her notes is instructive for anyone learning to design algorithms or architect software systems, because they show the birth of algorithmic thinking, how to break a problem into ordered operations, and how to represent those operations unambiguously for a machine to follow. Takeaway: her vision isn't just a historical curiosity, it's a living template for how to think about computation. Read her translated notes, implement the Bernoulli algorithm yourself in a modern language, and reflect on how separating data from instructions changes system design. Learn to program, teach someone else, support women in computing. Small actions today keep her pioneering ideas active and useful for the next generation of innovators. 6. Modern pioneers against systemic odds. Women today lead breakthrough work across industries while confronting persistent structural barriers that limit access to capital, visibility, and decision-making power. These barriers take many forms: exclusionary networks that favor established insiders, research funding systems biased towards certain institutions, hiring practices that prioritize traditional career paths, and cultural expectations that place disproportionate caregiving burdens on women. The problem is not a lack of talent, it is systems that were not designed to include everyone equally. One response has been direct disruption. Modern pioneers build new architectures where old ones fail. Some create institutions to train and elevate others, turning scarcity into supply. For example, community-driven education initiatives teach practical skills that traditional training pipelines overlook, while open datasets and shared tools democratize access to research fields that once required elite lab access. Other leaders press institutions from within, using board seats, executive roles, and policy positions to change hiring, procurement, and grant-making practices. These strategies flip the script from individual survival to collective capacity building. Concrete tactics make these strategies replicable. Founders of grassroots education programs set up locally run clubs and curriculum resources that scale through partnerships with schools and tech companies, pairing hands-on learning with mentorship from women who work in the field. Scientists pushed for open, high-quality datasets and reproducible methods, lowering the barrier for new entrants and accelerating discovery. Executives and policymakers introduced transparent candidate slates, invested in leadership pipelines, and negotiated institutional parental leave and flexible work policies so caregivers can remain competitive for promotions. Each tactic targets a choke point: talent identification, resource access, or institutional culture, and applies a practical fix that others can copy. Bringing these lessons into your sphere is straightforward. Organizations can adopt transparent hiring rules, fund or volunteer with programs that build skills for underrepresented women, and insist on supplier diversity in procurement. Researchers and technologists can publish code and data openly, mentor junior colleagues from marginalized backgrounds, and lobby their institutions for equitable grant review processes. Individuals can sponsor internships, join boards of nonprofits that focus on education and women's leadership, or push employers to track and publish diversity metrics. These are not symbolic steps. They change pathways and create measurable opportunity. Take action now. Support programs that train girls and women in the skills of the future, amplify leaders who are building inclusive institutions, and demand accountability from workplaces and funders. Mentor someone, donate time or funds to credible organizations that expand access to education and capital, and ask your employer to adopt concrete policies, like diverse hiring shortlists and paid caregiver leave, that remove structural obstacles. Small moves, when multiplied, create durable systems that allow more pioneers to thrive. They were told it couldn't be done, banned from labs, classrooms, cockpits, and ballots. But they kept going. The problem was clear: a world built to exclude them. The solution was even clearer: relentless curiosity, fierce courage, and refusal to accept impossible. We saw it in the scientist who kept returning to the lab until the laws of physics gave way, the mathematician who mapped trajectories when no one thought she belonged in mission control, the pilot who stared down horizons and kept flying. They shattered expectations, built new tools, and opened doors that once seemed welded shut. Key points: systemic barriers existed, individual and collective resilience overcame them, and those breakthroughs rewrote what was possible for everyone. You feel that legacy now, in technologies you use, careers that are open, and the stories we finally pass on. Let their grit remind you that barriers are made to be tested. Bring their courage into your day. Challenge one assumption, speak up once more, support someone who's being told no. If this inspired you, like, subscribe, and share the story. Tell us which pioneer moved you most in the comments. We're planning a deeper dive into one life per episode, starting next week with an intimate look at the scientist whose discoveries changed medicine forever. Keep watching and keep defying the impossible.